At 11:01 a.m. on April 3, 2026, the telemetry from the remote automatic weather stations near the San Gorgonio Pass began to register a localized atmospheric anomaly. On Gilman Springs Road, a spark met a landscape that the state of California had officially declared drought-free just 90 days prior. Within minutes, the report was 50 acres. By 1:30 p.m., it was 1,500, an area larger than Central Park, consumed in the time it takes to watch a feature film. This is not a slow-moving disaster. It is a kinetic event occurring in real time, a high-velocity consumption of the California dream. What scientists saw in the data from the week preceding this ignition changed everything we thought we knew about the 2026 fire season. This is the Springs Fire, and it is the physical manifestation of a catastrophic failure in the state's hydrological forecasting. The sky above Moreno Valley did not turn orange. It turned a bruised, suffocating brown before most residents even realized the hills were orbiting with heat. Frank Disney, looking out from his home in the Moreno Valley Ranch neighborhood, saw the horizon vanish. He thought his neighbors' roofs were already ignited. They weren't, not yet. The fire was still miles away, but it was traveling through the dry chaparral at 55 miles per hour, accelerated by the geological wind tunnel of the San Gorgonio Pass. By 7 p.m. that evening, the Springs Fire had claimed 4,176 acres. It was only 25% contained. Evacuation orders were flashing across cell phones in 8 different zones of Riverside County, while 100 miles to the northwest, the Crown Fire near Acton had already claimed another 345 acres. 2 fires, 2 counties, one terrifying afternoon. The scale of this movement is staggering. We are looking at a growth rate of roughly 84 acres per hour across an entire afternoon. In the history of California firefighting, April is supposed to be the green window, the crucial buffer between the winter rains and the summer's parching heat. It is the time when vegetation should hold enough cellular moisture to resist ignition, or at least slow the rate of spread. But on April 1, 2026, just 48 hours before the first flame, engineers from the California Department of Water Resources drove to Phillips Station in the Sierra Nevada. They pushed their measuring rods into the snowpack. The result was a chilling 18% of the historical average. In the northern Sierra, the heart of the state's water system, it was a ghost-like 6%. It was the second worst snowpack on record, occurring in a year where the state had no official drought. The disconnect between the drought-free status and the 18% snowpack is the engine of this crisis. We are witnessing the birth of a new kind of seasonal volatility, where the rain falls hard and fast, flooding the valleys, but the mountains remain bare. The soil is wet, but the fuels are bone dry. The clock is no longer ticking. The alarm has already been silenced by the roar of the wind. The chronology of the Springs Fire is a study in atmospheric physics and logistical desperation. At 11:01 a.m., the first 911 calls originated from Gilman Springs Road, a high-traffic artery skirting the base of the Box Springs Mountains. Within 12 minutes, the first responding CAL FIRE units from Riverside County Station 91 reported a dangerous rate of spread. The fire was not merely crawling through the brush, it was being sucked into the San Gorgonio Pass, a geological feature that acts as a continental-scale Venturi tube. This pass, situated between the 11,000-foot peaks of the San Bernardino and San Jacinto Mountains, compresses air flowing from the high deserts of the Great Basin towards the lower-pressure coastal sink of the Los Angeles Basin. As the air is forced through this narrow gap, it accelerates. By 11:45 a.m., the remote automatic weather station, ROS, at Benning, began recording sustained gusts of 48 miles per hour, with peak gusts hitting 62. The physics of this wind-driven event were compounded by a catastrophic drop in relative humidity, RH, which plummeted from 34% to 9% in less than 2 hours. This is the blowtorch effect, Simultaneously, at 12:26 p.m., seismographs and firewatch cameras 100 miles to the northwest picked up a second heat signature near Acton in northern Los Angeles County. The Crown Fire had ignited. For the California Department of Forestry and Fire Protection, CAL FIRE, and the U.S. Forest Service, this was the nightmare scenario. Two major incidents in two separate counties, both occurring within the same wind corridor system, both threatening high-density wildland-urban interface (WUI) zones. The geophysical data from the USGS and NOAA during these hours paints a picture of a landscape primed for total consumption. Seismometers in the region, typically tuned to the San Andreas Fault, which bisects the pass, registered the acoustic roar of the fire, a low-frequency vibration caused by the sheer intensity of the thermal column. By 2 p.m., the Springs fire had produced a pyrocumulus cloud that reached an altitude of 28,000 feet, visible from downtown Los Angeles. This cloud was not just smoke. It was a weather-generating engine, creating its own internal lightning and downdrafts that pushed the fire in multiple directions at once, leapfrogging containment lines. The why behind this speed lies in the fuel moisture data. While the valleys had seen record rainfall in January, the Sierra Nevada snowpack, the state's primary cooling mechanism and slow-release irrigation system, was non-existent at 18% of average. According to Sean Peterson of the National Interagency Coordination Center, the green-up seen in February was a biological illusion. The lush grass was shallow-rooted. Without this steady infiltration of snowmelt, the underlying soil moisture at the 1,000 to 3,000 foot elevation mark vanished by mid-March. By April 3rd, the live fuel moisture, LFM, in the chaparral, the amount of water held within the leaves of the plants themselves, had dropped to 58%. For context, fire scientists consider 60% to be the critical threshold where vegetation shifts from being a heat absorber to a high-octane fuel. Infrastructure vulnerability was exposed within the first 90 minutes. Southern California Edison was forced to de-energize the 115 kilovolt transmission lines running through the pass to prevent further ignitions, cutting power to over 14,000 residents as the temperature outside soared into the high 80s. The I-10 corridor, a vital national supply chain artery, was choked with smoke, forcing a total closure and stranding hundreds of commercial freight trucks. At 4:30 p.m., as the fire hit 3,500 acres, the $21 billion California Wildfire Fund faced its second major stress test in 14 months. Jack Buckley, a risk advisor at Capstone Energy, noted in a simulated memo that the state's financial buffer is being eroded faster than it can be replenished. The system was redlining. The Springs fire was no longer just a local incident. It was a systemic failure of the buffer we assumed we had until June. The data provides a chilling perspective on the cyclical nature of Californian catastrophes, but the metrics of 2026 have shattered the historical baseline. To understand why the Springs fire is not a seasonal anomaly, we must look at the precedent that maps most directly onto this crisis: the summer of 2021. That year, the statewide snowpack on April 1st was measured at 59% of the historical average, a figure that at the time felt catastrophic. It triggered early warnings from the USGS and CAL FIRE. By July, those warnings materialized into the Dixie Fire, a monster that ignited near the Feather River Canyon and burned for 95 days. It consumed 963,000 acres, becoming the largest single fire in the state's recorded history. The town of Greenville was erased in a single afternoon as a wall of orange crossed the ridgeline, reducing Victorian-era mainstays to twisted metal and ash. But there is a terrifying divergence in the 2026 data. In 2021, we had a 59% snowpack. Today, we are standing at 18%. The Dixie Fire was a summer campaign fire that peaked in August. The Springs Fire is performing with similar kinetic energy in early April. This shift is the result of a coupled system failure between atmospheric temperature and hydrological storage. Carla Nemeth, director of the California Department of Water Resources, highlighted this during the April 1st survey at Phillips Station. She described snowpack not just as water for faucets, but as stored fire suppression. In a normal cycle, the snow acts as a massive thermal heat sink. It slowly melts through May and June, keeping the soil moisture high and the vapor pressure deficit, VPD, the difference between how much moisture is in the air and how much it can hold, at manageable levels. When the snow vanishes by March, the VPD spikes 2 months early. The science of the atmospheric river paradox of 2025 to 2026 is what fooled the public. In January 2026, the state was declared drought-free because the reservoirs, like Shasta and Oroville, were at 110% of their historical capacity. But the rain that filled those reservoirs fell as warm rain due to a persistent Pacific high-pressure ridge. It bypassed the snow stage entirely. While the valley floors were green, the mountains, the primary defense against the summer's heat, were naked. By the time the record heat of March 2026 arrived, there was no snow to melt. The vegetation above 3,000 feet, specifically the dense chaparral and manzanita of the Riverside County corridors, dried to cured levels 60 days ahead of schedule. Statistically, the probability of a 1,000-acre fire in April in the San Gorgonio Pass is historically less than 2%. The Springs fire reached that threshold in 150 minutes. This is a radical acceleration of the fire cycle. We are moving from seasonal risk to permanent volatility. The National Interagency Coordination Center, NICC, had released a forecast in February 2026, predicting above normal significant fire potential for the entirety of the Pacific Southwest. But the speed of the Springs fire suggests that even our most aggressive models are lagging behind the physical reality of the fuel beds. The twist in this dataset is the Eaton fire of January 2025. It burned nearly 10,000 structures in Altadena during what was supposed to be the wettest month of the year. It proved that the Santa Ana wind events, which used to be restricted to the autumn, are now coupling with out-of-season dry spells to create year-round fire windows. The 2026 snowpack of 18% is the final mechanical piece of this disaster. If 59% gave us the Dixie Fire in July, what does 18% give us in April? The system is no longer resetting. The fire return interval, the time a landscape needs to recover before it can burn again, is being compressed to the point of extinction for certain Californian ecosystems. We are not just losing homes, we are losing the biological capacity of the land to hold on to moisture. The Springs fire is the confirmation of a new, high-velocity era, where the calendar is no longer a reliable guide for survival. The human geography of the Springs fire is defined by a dangerous proximity that Moreno Valley has ignored for decades. For Frank Disney, standing in his driveway in the Moreno Valley Ranch neighborhood, the disaster was not a distant report on a screen. It was a sensory assault. The wind, screaming through the San Gorgonio Pass at 55 miles per hour, carried with it the granulated remains of the Box Springs Mountains, ash, scorched grit, and embers the size of coins. Frank described the atmosphere as solid. He couldn't see the house 3 doors down, leading to the terrifying conclusion that the entire block was already engulfed. In reality, the fire was still a mile up the slope, but in a wind-driven event of this magnitude, the distance is an illusion. When a fire moves at 84 acres per hour, a mile is roughly 10 minutes of life. Maurice Williams, a 20-year resident of the hillsides, represents the institutional memory of the region. He had seen the buffer work in decades past. He recalled Aprils where the hills were so saturated that even a downed power line would only produce a smolder. But on April 3, 2026, he watched the chaparral, dried to tinder by the failed snowpack, detonate. "I've never seen it this close, this early," he told emergency responders. "It's like the season skipped a chapter." By 3:30 p.m., Maurice was part of a mass exodus. Riverside County, the fourth most populated county in the United States, with 2.4 million residents, was suddenly facing a logistical bottleneck. Evacuation zones 1 through 8 were active. The I-60 and I-10 interchange became a parking lot of panicked families, while the smoke plume, a dark, roiling wall, blocked out the sun. The defensive posture of the community was captured by Dave Cappuccilli, who was found by news crews wetting down his pergola with a garden hose. It was a gesture of profound futility. "I'm just wetting down anything that's flammable," he said, hoping to keep the embers from making their way into places. This is the reality of the Wildland-Urban Interface, WUI, in 2026. Moreno Valley expanded toward the Box Springs Mountains during the housing booms of the 1990s and 2000s, pushing wood-framed civilization directly into a natural fire corridor. Gilman Springs Road is not just a street. It is the front line where maintained lawns meet thousands of tons of accumulated fuel loads that haven't seen a significant burn in a generation. The logistical strain on the state's resources was immediate and staggering. By 5 p.m., 260 firefighters were on the ground at the Springs fire alone. This included 36 engines and 10 air tankers, many of which had been diverted from maintenance cycles or other smaller incidents across the western United States. These are campaign-level resources, typically reserved for the peak of a California August, now being deployed on a Friday in early April. The cost of this deployment is carving a hole in municipal budgets. The California Wildfire Fund, that $21 billion reserve created to shield utilities from liability, is already under shadow, following the Eaton fire of January 2025, which destroyed 9,418 structures in Altadena and caused an estimated $12 billion in insured losses. The fund's current balance has been kept from the public. The psychological damage is perhaps more permanent. In Altadena, 14 months after the Eaton fire, families are still not home. The slab phenomenon defines their neighborhoods, bare concrete foundations where homes once stood, with only the rusted frames of washers and dryers remaining in the ash. Rebuilding permits are moving at a glacial pace because the insurance industry has effectively redlined the WUI. For the residents of Moreno Valley, the Springs fire is a terrifying reminder that their safety was built on a hydrological lie. The infrastructure failure extends to the digital realm. As the fire neared the communication towers on the ridge, cell service for thousands of evacuees flickered and died. Southern California Edison's public safety power shutoffs, PSPS, meant that even those not in the direct path were plunged into a dark sky emergency. Without power, the electric pumps for many local water wells failed, leaving residents with dry taps just as the embers began to land on their roofs. This is the cascading failure of the modern American WUI. A wind-driven fire, a lack of mountain snowmelt, a de-energized grid, and a population that believed the state was saved because it rained in January. The Springs fire is proving that in the new California, water in the reservoir does not mean safety on the hillside. The containment lines on the perimeter of the Springs fire may hold tonight, providing a fragile temporary truce between the flames and the suburbs of Moreno Valley. At 25% containment, the immediate threat to the Moreno Valley Ranch neighborhood has been mitigated by the sheer force of 260 firefighters and a massive aerial assault. But a contained fire is not a solved problem. It is a localized pause in regional systemic collapse. The vegetation profile that allowed a fire to consume 4,176 acres in a single April afternoon will not improve. it will worsen. Every day that the sun rises over the San Bernardino Mountains without a deep insulating layer of snowpack to cool the high elevation soil, the moisture deficit deepens. We are witnessing the albedo effect in reverse. Instead of white snow reflecting energy back into space, the dark exposed rock and soil are absorbing it, accelerating the evapotranspiration of what little water remains in the chaparral. The future risk for the remainder of 2026 is mathematically high. Sean Peterson's warning in February was not an observation. It was a forecast based on the coupling of atmospheric instability and desiccated fuels. If the spring's fire is the benchmark for April, the projections for August and September are off the charts. We are looking at a state where the fire season has effectively been erased by a fire year. The vulnerability of the California power grid is now a permanent state of being. The San Gorgonio Pass, beyond being a wind tunnel, is a critical corridor for high-voltage transmission lines that feed the Los Angeles basin. If these corridors become perpetual ignition points, the state faces a choice between permanent rolling blackouts during high wind events or the total depletion of the California Wildfire Fund. The financial implications are staggering. The $21 billion reserve established to prevent the insolvency of major utilities like Southern California Edison and PG&E was designed for a 2019 climate reality. It did not account for a 14-month interval between 10,000 structure disasters like the Eaton fire and the start of a catastrophic April season. If the balance of that fund, currently undisclosed, is as low as analysts like Jack Buckley fear, the state may be forced to seek federal intervention or a massive taxpayer bailout before the summer heat even arrives. This is the hidden cost of the 18% snowpack. It is a financial dead man's switch. Beyond the finances, there is the risk to the national supply chain. The Inland Empire is the logistics heart of the United States. The warehouses of Moreno Valley, Ontario, and Riverside handle a significant percentage of the goods entering through the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach. When the I-10 and I-60 corridors are shut down by smoke and fire, the ripple effect is felt in rail yards in Chicago and retail shelves in New York. We are seeing that a localized brush fire in a California pass is a tectonic scale event for the American economy. The civilization inside the fire corridor is not just a local problem. It is a structural weakness in the national infrastructure. The ecological shift is equally alarming. This is type conversion in real time. When a landscape burns too frequently, accelerated by these out-of-season events, the native deep-rooted chaparral cannot recover. It is replaced by invasive, fleshy Mediterranean grasses that dry out even faster and ignite with the smallest spark. This creates a feedback loop of fire. More fire leads to more grass, which leads to more fire. The landscape is being engineered by the flames into a state of permanent volatility. The data for 2026 is clear, and it is unforgiving. The state was declared drought-free in January because the reservoirs were full. But the reservoirs are a metric of human storage, not ecological health. The snowpack, the true pulse of the Mountain West, read 18% on April 1st. The fire ignited on April 3rd. The math is not hidden. It is written in the lack of white on the peaks and the brown of the sky above the San Gorgonio Pass. The season has 8 months left to run. The spring fire is not the end of the story. It is the first chapter of a year that will redefine the cost of living in the American West. The system is telling us what comes next. All we have to do is follow the data. If this story is worth telling, subscribe. We cover more of these every week.